everyone, and thanks very much for coming along today. I think, well, what I'm going to do today hopefully is convince you, if you're not already convinced enough already, that urban green spaces are important. They present very important opportunities for city dwellers to actually connect with nature. I think one of the questions that was posed in the synopsis for my talk today was, what's your favourite green space in Perth? And I'm just going to start with some pictures of my favourite green space, which is a little bit cliche, I know, but it's Kings Park. And I like to go walking here a lot, mainly first thing on a Sunday morning when it's nice and quiet and I can just enjoy my own little bit of nature. But you probably have your own favourite green spaces and your own reasons why they're meaningful. But what makes them so special to you? Do you actually feel that you can connect with nature when you're there? How does it happen, and does it even matter? So these are all questions that I've been tackling as part of my PhD, and today I'd like to share with you some of what I've discovered so far. So what I was thinking of doing today is just starting off with explaining a bit about why I'm interested in urban green spaces and what got me started thinking about some of these questions in the first place. And then I'll talk about the two main parts of my study. So the first involves some interviews with green space users, which I conducted last year, and the second relates to a survey which I'm currently still working on. There is time for questions at the end, but please feel free to shout out at any time if anything's not clear. Probably before I go any further, I should explain what I mean by urban green space. So I'm basically referring to the vegetated parts of the city. And these can be areas of public green space, so things like neighbourhood parks, sporting ovals, bush reserves. They can be semi-private green spaces, like golf courses, for example. And they can be private green spaces, so these are essentially people's backyards. And I guess really my interest in urban green space is because they're usually among some of the few areas where city dwellers can actually interact with the natural environment, or at least readily interact with nature. And my study is based entirely in Perth because we anticipate that the population here is going to increase from 2 million to 3.5 million people by about 2050. And most of the urban planning strategies to accommodate that growth are looking at things like infill development and higher residential density. So we can anticipate that urban green space is going to be increasingly at a premium. So why should we even bother about urban green space? Well, I probably don't need to tell you that a lot of work has already been done into all these fabulous benefits that urban green spaces provide. Among them, this whole suite of physical and mental health and well-being benefits. So studies have found that in areas with more urban green space, populations show increased rates of physical activity. There are reduced rates of cardiovascular disease, low rates of obesity, increased emotional well-being, even reduced rates of aggression and lower crime. So one recent study suggested that spending even as little as just half an hour once a week in an urban green space might be enough to reduce population prevalence of things like depression and high blood pressure by 7% and 9% respectively. Now this is quite profound. It could represent, a huge public health saving by doing something that's relatively simple, because something like depression alone costs about $12.5 billion a year to treat in Australia. Studies have also shown that urban green space is helpful for combating things like urban heat island effect. It can help to regulate air and water quality, reduce household energy use. And there's evidence too that urban green space can contribute towards increased species richness and biodiversity conservation. So all of these benefits are absolutely fantastic, but what about the sorts of things that you and I tend to relate to most when we're in a green space? Like me in Kings Park, for example, the things that make it most special to me are things like beauty and solitude and the ability to connect with nature. So these intangible benefits are really important because they help to explain how people actually experience the natural environment. And they can also contribute towards our preferences and our well-being and our health. But these intangible benefits also tend to be quite difficult to define and tricky to measure. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But I just want to mention Richard Louv, who in his book Last Child in the Woods sort of diagnosed many Western nations like ours with nature deficit disorder. And this was basically based on the observation that we seem to be spending less time outdoors now compared to previous generations. And this is really to our detriment because we risk missing out on some of these health and well-being benefits. And round about the same time, Robert Pyle was talking about the extinction of experience. And this is a little bit more serious because it's talking about an ever-diminishing connection between people and the natural environment. And the risk here is that as people feel less connected with nature, they also tend to care about it less and act less to protect it. And I guess in a way it makes sense because if you think about it, just because a natural environment, or in this case, just because urban green space is there, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to use it. So if people feel more connected with nature, then it makes sense that they'll also want to spend more time there. So connecting with nature actually assumes an additional importance from the perspective of potentially actually unlocking some of these benefits that green spaces offer. So all of these things got me thinking about the importance of connecting with nature and I guess the role of urban green space in helping city dwellers to connect with nature. And I thought too that, because I like a bit of a challenge, I'd look into the role of these sort of tricky to define, difficult to measure non-material benefits in, how that actually helps people to establish that connection. Okay, so this brings me to what I've been doing. What have I been doing? Well, you can insert your favourite PhD student joke here because we all know that PhD students don't actually do any work, and this is one of my favourites. But seriously though, what have I been doing? I actually started with some interviews of green space users, and I did this because I wanted to hear about people's experiences of green space in detail and in their own words. So I decided to focus on a single local government area, and I chose the city of Stirling, which is about 8 kilometres north of the Perth CBD. And I chose Stirling because compared to the other metropolitan local governments, it's the largest by population. It's already highly urbanised, but it has quite a good proportion and a good mix of parks. And I spoke to 25 green space users, 10 of whom were stewards. And by stewards, I mean people who are engaged in local community-based bush care activities. So these are basically members of Friends of Local Bushland groups. And I wanted to speak to stewards to see if there was any difference between the way that stewards and non-stewards perceived non-material benefits and in the way that they connected with nature. So what I found was that people really did talk about their favourite green spaces in terms of benefits, many of which were non-material. And I just want to spend a little bit of time on that now. And I'm just going to use some of the quotes from my interviews. I'm just going to use this stacked bar chart as well, just to give an idea of the main categories of non-material benefits that people were talking about. And the size of the coloured block sort of gives you a little bit of an indication of how many mentions that each thing got in interviews. So people talked about, of course, the aesthetic benefit of green spaces. So they were talking about things like beautiful views, but also discovering new things. So people were talking about learning about the local community and about the natural environment in green space. but also the ability to teach others about the environment. And people mentioned feelings of awe and wonder as well at being able to interact with birds and animals and reptiles and so on in green spaces. People talked about the ability to escape the urban environment when they're in green space, so the ability to get away from concrete and from traffic noise. And sometimes just the ability to escape from other people as well. In terms of heritage benefits, people talked about the ability to link with the past in green spaces. So the ability to not only see what the urban environment used to look like, but also what the natural environment used to look like. And for some people, green spaces were really integral to their own personal histories, particularly if they'd lived in an area for a very long time. People talked about inspirational benefits, so a couple of people talked about wanting to take photographs in green space or felt compelled to create artworks. There are a lot of mentions of recreational benefits from green space. In terms of reflection, some people scoffed at the idea of reflecting in a green space, but for others they were actually a very valuable opportunity to just contemplate things and to put their worries into perspective. There are, of course, a lot of mentions of the calming and the soothing and peaceful nature of green space, and just a feeling of being unencumbered from sort of daily chores. Interestingly enough, people with gardens felt that they couldn't really relax unless they were in a public green space like a park, because they felt less obligated to tidy up and to do work. And similarly, stewards often felt that they couldn't achieve that same sense of relaxation unless they were in a reserve that was not their home reserve. Social benefits, of course, so green spaces were important places for people to catch up with friends and family, but also opportunities for just impromptu social contact, so something as simple as just saying good morning to other passers-by. And there was also an element of vicarious benefits. So this is where people actually felt enjoyment purely from seeing other people around them enjoying themselves. And there were also a few mentions of spiritual benefit, not necessarily in a religious sense, but just in a way that was beyond the five main senses. So interestingly, there seemed to be a little bit of a difference between the way that stewards and non-stewards experienced green spaces. So stewards tended to emphasize particular non-material benefits, especially discovery. So they felt that they learnt new things, particularly through their stewardship activities and also through coming into contact with experts. They felt a particular affinity with the past in green space, particularly the way that the natural environment used to look. And they also felt particular feelings of well-being from making a difference. But having said that, it wasn't always positive. Sometimes advantages could actually become disadvantages if they crossed into the extreme. So, for example, knowing too much could actually compromise those feelings of wonder and awe at the natural environment. Also, sort of the extent of emotional and practical investment made by stewards could sometimes lead to conflict with other vested interests. Quite often led to sometimes overwhelming feelings of duty and responsibility, and quite often frustration as well, that other people just didn't seem to share that same sense of passion and commitment. So I also wanted to have a look at what factors might be influencing some of these non-material benefits that people were perceiving. And this is just a very, very simplified depiction of that. So on the far right, we've got some of these non-material benefits that I've been talking about. And as you'd expect, the actual green space attributes had a bearing on the benefits that people perceived. So these could be spatial factors, so things like how accessible or how large a green space was, also what type of facilities there might be, how well maintained an area was, Also natural features, so things like how lush a green space might be, or the ratio between trees and grass, how open an area was. But also temporal factors too, so people's use and experience of green space was influenced by time of the day and even seasonal changes. Human factors in the middle were also very important for influencing people's perceived non-material benefits. So these were things like the sorts of activities that people actually did in green space and people's held values. So these are the sort of the deep down beliefs which we all have, which guide our preferences and our behaviour. And certainly in the interviews there were indications that values had a bearing on the sorts of benefits that people perceived, and also people's memories. So it really, I mean, it's these human factors that make green space experience very, very personal and very individual. And I mean, there's been a fair amount of work that's already been done into place and meaning, and I guess my findings really complement those in a way by demonstrating that these non-material benefits really do matter to people, and they do seem to contribute towards making green spaces meaningful. Just as a little bit of an aside, I've been very careful to use the term non-material benefits. I'm aware that in the literature these are often referred to as cultural ecosystem services. The problem is that I guess cultural ecosystem services are still very ambiguous, and some of that stems from an inconsistent use of terminology. But perhaps one of the most defining features of cultural ecosystem services is this aspect of human and environment co-production in order to realise some benefit. And the form of these human inputs tends to be as perception or as transformation in the mind of the user. So on this basis, there's certainly all the hallmarks are here that sort of cultural ecosystem services from urban green spaces are important, and there certainly is that evidence of that strong sort of human and environment interplay that's taking place. But are people actually connecting with nature in these spaces? So to test this, I actually came up with a conceptual framework, and I developed a number of indicators. And I'm just going to superimpose, again, some of the quotes from my interviews and hopefully show that there does seem to be evidence that people are connecting in green space. So if we have a look at a spectrum that goes from left to right, from a more superficial to a more deep and meaningful connection with nature, people who are more connected with nature tend to feel more immersed in the natural environment. And rather than sort of focusing purely on the way that their surroundings look or by using very descriptive language, people who are more connected with nature tend to use more emotive terminology, and they tend to use more metaphor. So they tend to show signs of more emotional connection with place. Rather than feeling more anxious about the environment, people who are more connected with nature tend to convey a greater sense of trust and familiarity with their surroundings. And rather than focusing purely on acquiring information through very conscious means or very rational thought, people who are more connected with nature tend to sort of experience more tacitly their surroundings and acquire information more subliminally. And rather than sort of focusing on the environment in terms of what it means for me as an individual, people who are more connected with nature tend to show a greater awareness of effects beyond the self. So I mean, this is just a very quick snapshot, but there does seem to be evidence there that there is some sort of connection that's happening in green space. This brings me to what I'm doing at the moment. So The interviews were fantastic because, I mean, it yielded a great deal of very, very rich data. But ultimately, it represented the views of 25 people from a single local government area. So earlier this year, I ran an online survey with a view to getting a larger sample of green space users from across the Perth metro area. And I was asking people questions about their green space use, about their experiences, perceived non-material benefits, and about connecting with nature. And hopefully these results will reveal a bit more about the importance of urban green space in actually helping people connect with nature. So I'm still actually analysing my results at the moment, so I can only really just give you a little bit of a sneak peek on some early results. So I'm just going to focus in on a couple of the questions that related to connecting with nature. So this question here, I asked people, how important is it for you to feel connected with nature in the city? And this represents the views of over 400 responses. And once again, I was looking at the difference between stewards and non-stewards. So stewards, which is on the bottom here, perhaps not unsurprisingly, were more likely to find it extremely important to connect with nature in the city. So that's just the dark blue part of the bar chart there. So approximately 70% of stewards thought it was extremely important compared to around about 45% of non-stewards. Non-stewards seem to show a sort of a broader range of opinions. So, you know, right here on the left, you've got a few stewards as well who didn't think it was important at all. But by and large, regardless of stewardship status, most people thought that it was at least moderately important to connect with nature. So those blue parts of the chart. I also asked people, where do you connect with nature? And by far the most popular response, if we just look at the light green area, regardless of stewardship status, most people thought that they connected with nature in a mixture of urban green space and wilderness areas outside the city. Now this is interesting because it suggests that urban green space alone might not be enough for people to actually feel that connection, that they may feel that they still need to get out of the city sometimes and just experience a little bit of wilderness as well. Having said that, non-stewards were more likely to actually feel that they could connect with nature in urban green space alone. So that's just that yellow part of the top chart. Regardless of stewardship status though, if you tally up the categories with urban green space, so we combine the yellow and the light green sections, by far the overwhelming majority of respondents, and we're talking over 90% of people here, felt that they could connect at least in part or completely in urban green space. So I guess again it sort of highlights the importance of urban green space for this purpose, for connecting with nature. I just wanted to share a couple of other insights from my analysis so far. I've been talking about where people connect with nature, but at a more fundamental level, I guess, is what nature actually means to people. And I was interested to look into this because if you think about it, if somebody thinks that nature is only to be found in a pristine wilderness or in an area that's completely apart from humans, then it's unlikely that urban green spaces are ever going to actually be able to deliver that. So one of the questions that I asked in my survey was for people to actually define what nature means to them. And I asked people to just use their own words to give a definition of nature. And this graphic here is just a summary of the qualitative analysis that I did on people's responses. And the size of the word just gives an indication of how prominently it featured in people's definitions. Now you might be quite interested to note that humans actually featured quite prominently in people's definitions. But I should perhaps note that humans was actually used most often in conjunction with words like without and none. So a lot of people were defining nature as being an area without humans or in an area with minimal or no human impact. But some other sort of terms that cropped up quite a lot, you might notice things like plants, animals, environment. Some people thought it was everything. So we just have a look at the most commonly mentioned themes in decreasing order. So the majority of people define nature as being a mix of biotic and abiotic components, which may or may not include humans. So people were mostly listing things like plants, animals, rocks, the weather. But then, as I mentioned before, there were quite a few mentions as well of nature as being something that isn't man-made, or the way that it might look without people, or how it was before there were humans. This is something I'm still exploring at the moment, but my early analysis would suggest that there actually isn't any sort of clear-cut association between where people are connecting with nature and what they actually think nature is. Now, this is quite surprising for me, but I guess my early thoughts on it would be because nature is such a complex concept, and for most people, even as an individual, we actually conceive of nature as being made up of lots of very different facets. So, as I said, it's something I'm still sort of looking into at the moment. But again, non-material benefits seem to feature quite prominently in the way that people were describing nature. So I guess for me, again, it sort of highlights how important these non-material benefits might be for people to actually articulate nature and the natural environment. Okay, we're into the home stretch now. I'm just going to summarize some of my findings so far. So first of all, non-material benefits matter. People do actually talk about their favorite green spaces in terms of non-material benefits. So they are talking about things like beauty and about learning things and about escape. There do seem to be some slight differences between the way that stewards and non-stewards experience urban green space, based on the different sort of emphases that they place on particular non-material benefits. As I mentioned before, there is this evidence of this strong interaction between humans and the environment. So both the attributes of green space and human factors as well have a bearing on the types of benefits that people perceive. And there is evidence that city dwellers can and do connect with nature, at least to some extent, in urban green space, although again there might be some slight differences between stewards and non-stewards. As I'm still sort of going through and analysing data at the moment, I am exploring possible factors that might be influencing these differences between the way that people perceive, benefit and connect with nature. So some of the things that I'm looking at exploring a little bit further are things like nature relatedness. So this basically measures people's cognitive and emotional attachment with nature. I'm also going to have a look at whether particular urban green space attributes might have a bearing, and I'm just going to look at naturalness as an example. Also whether people's frequency and duration of green space use might have an effect, and whether certain demographic variables might be having an influence too. So I guess really my take-home message from today would be that urban green spaces are important. So as well as all these fantastic physical and mental health and well-being benefits that we know that green spaces provide, they're also a really important source of non-material benefit. And they are places where city dwellers feel that they can connect with nature in the city. Now this is something that we should probably be encouraging, because if the theories are correct, then as people feel more connected with nature, they're likely to think about it more and act more to protect it. But also if people feel more connected with nature, they're more likely to actually want to spend time there. So potentially that acts as a key to unlock all these other health and well-being benefits that green spaces provide. Now, of course, the challenge is actually translating some of this into policy and into a management context, because intangible benefits by their very nature they're difficult to define and they're difficult to measure. But hopefully I've at least convinced you that they are important and they are worthy of consideration, because they really do seem to underscore the meaning, I guess, that people seem to ascribe to natural environments in the city. So thank you very much.